Well, good morning, everybody. Late morning, almost afternoon. My name is Ariel Whiteley-Knoll. I am the horticulture agent for K-State Research and Extension in Shawnee County. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We're so glad to have you to talk about unusual fruits. This is a really great presentation that our Extension Master Gardener Kevin Siek gave at the Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library earlier this year. That's Kevin with the awesome tropical background. Is that a pawpaw behind you, Kevin? Oh, you're muted.
There you go. Yeah, I'm sitting out here in the pawpaw patch this morning.
Excellent. Very appropriate. So we are really, really excited to get started. We are recording this session so that those that cannot watch are able to see it later. So today, while Kevin is talking, I will be monitoring the chat box. So if you want to take just a second right now to locate that, if you don't know where it is. And if you have questions as he goes along, go ahead and throw it in the chat box. And if we get a couple questions, I'll stop Kevin so we can talk about it as a group. And then at the end, we can all come back in this format and have a great discussion about fruits if that's what you all would like to do once his presentation has concluded. So I will turn it over to Kevin. As I do during the presentation, please make sure that you are both muted and that your cameras are off. Our cameras tend to eat up a lot of bandwidth, so sometimes that can cause connectivity issues. And if at any point in time you lose connection or we lose connection, if you lose connection, just log back in and join us. If we lose connection, just stay here and we'll resume just as soon as, typically it's just an internet problem when that happens, as soon as we're able. So if we do have any kind of issues, just sit tight and we'll take care of it. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Kevin and we can start talking about unusual fruits.
Okay, let me see if I can get this presentation up here. Good. Okay. So far, so good. All right, there we go. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to my presentation on unusual fruits, rediscovering some forgotten gems. And of course, this is brought to you by the Shawnee County Extension Master Gardener Program. Let me begin by just saying that we're part of the K-State Research and Extension Program, and therefore we're an affirmative action, equal opportunity outfit. We don't discriminate against people, and we try and be as inclusive as we can in all of our programs and activities. So what's my presentation going to be about today? Well, first, I just want to put in a little plug for Master Gardeners and what we do. We spend a whole lot of time every year spreading information, research-based information to the community about anything and everything that has to do with gardening through a variety of venues, including our demonstration gardens and our programs at the public library and at the farmers market. And our gardening response line, which we're doing virtually now, but we still got it going. And then, of course, programs like this. You know, now during this time of social distancing, we've endeavored to try and get more and more information out there to share online with folks. And my presentation on unusual fruits today is going to cover a lot of plants that were once popular plants, but then kind of fell by the wayside as they got replaced by plants that were more suitable to our, more mechanized commercial agriculture industry. But some of them are regaining popularity, and they're all well worthy of rediscovery. There's way more unusual fruits than I could cover in this presentation. So these are all going to be ones that'll do well in our hardiness zone of 6A here. I want to give a shout out to Lee Reich and his excellent book, Uncommon Fruit for Every Garden, that provided a lot of the source material for my presentation. If you're a Shawnee County Master Gardener, it's in our library. And then I also need to let you know that this presentation contains copyrighted material, the use of which was not specifically authorized by the copyright holders, but since it's all being presented purely for educational purposes, we believe it constitutes a fair use under the Copyright Act. And then I want to just say that unless it's otherwise noted, these pictures all came from the Missouri Botanical Garden website, which is an excellent website to learn more about plants that do well in our region. So why grow unusual fruits? Well, like I said, many of them, these are plants that are going to do well. A lot of them are native, so they're already well adapted to our region. They're all plants that are going to do well in average to medium well-drained soil in full or parts shade unless otherwise noted. And the plants that don't require a lot of the care that more traditional fruits like apples or peaches or something like that would require, because they have very few insect or disease problems, and they're all good candidates for a food forest garden, which a food forest is basically a diverse planting of edible plants that tries to emulate or mimic the natural environment, and it's arranged in layers just like in nature, from clear up from the overstory, big shade tree size trees, down to understory trees, shrubs, clear on down to root crops. So if you're planning on making your home landscape into a food forest, these are all good choices for you. So my first one is the pawpaw tree, and which is a favorite of mine, but it was a favorite of indigenous peoples and of the colonists when they arrived here. And it's one that's now regaining quite a bit of popularity. In fact, Kentucky State University has a research unit that's just dedicated to developing new varieties of pawpaws that are more marketable, have bigger, more flavorful fruit, and maybe has a little better shelf life and that kind of thing. But it's said that George Washington's favorite fruit was the pawpaw. Jefferson grew them at Monticello, and the Lewis and Clark expedition on their return trip from way out west, as they were traveling through Missouri, they ran short on provisions and had trouble finding game, so they actually subsisted on pawpaws for a period of time. And I also like this plant because it's the primary host of my little buddy here, the zebra swallowtail. It's a native understory tree, can get up to 30 foot tall, but probably not quite that big in our neck of the woods. It likes a moist, acidic soil and can tolerate some shade. It's the only non-tropical Asimina that grows in North America. Most of its brothers and sisters are all tropical or semi-tropical plants, and that the other members of this genus that grow in North America all grow down along the southern coast of the US. You're going to need more than one tree to produce fruit. I've heard him recommend trying to get 3 different varieties of trees. So plant at least 3 trees to get a good crop of pawpaws. Um, and the fruit ripens in early autumn, and you can eat it raw, which I like just eating fresh pawpaws. They're good in custards or pies. Cream pies are good. Uh, they say you can even make wine or beer out of it. No, I haven't tried that, but that's what they say. Sunflower is a cultivar that was actually developed from some stock out by Chanute, Kansas. Um, the next one is the persimmon. Um, its name, um, its name, Diospyros, is Greek for fruit of the gods, which whoever came up with that name obviously was eating a nice ripe persimmon because maybe you've heard the saying sour is a green persimmon. Well, they weren't kidding. They are probably the most bitter thing you'll ever put in your mouth. They're so astringent they literally pucker your mouth. But the ripe fruit has a real sweet, mellow taste. Some say a honey-like taste. They're very nutritious fruit. Um, this American persimmon is the only North American member of the ebony family, so it has a very dark, dense wood that is used to make like golf clubs and pool cues or parquet flooring, wherever they need like a really tough, hard wood. It's used for those sort of purposes, and it's another native that can get pretty big, up to 30 feet. Um, and I think it's a neat plant that has multi-seasonal interest. It gets these fragrant little flowers in the spring, but then in the wintertime, after it drops its leaves, it has this real interesting blocky bark that I like. It Right. Some people say the fruit is like dates. I think it has a flavor all of its own, but it can be eaten raw and in pies and puddings and all kinds of desserts. The female trees are going to need a male tree in order to set fruit. So bear that in mind when you go to the nursery to select your plants. Um, and here's some recommended varieties that K-State says does well around here. Next is the mulberry tree. Here we go around the mulberry bush. You probably remember that little rhyme from when you were a kid, but that is an English nursery rhyme that goes way back to the mid 1800s. The Romans first brought mulberries to Britain as a medicinal plant, but during Tudor times, it became a popular tree, both for its value as a nice shade tree, but also for its tasty berries. But Henry VIII had a mulberry tree in his garden. Shakespeare grew them in his garden. Um, and it's a tree that it's a large shade tree. You can get up to 50 foot. The fruits ripen in the summer. It's sweet and juicy and resembles a blackberry. Good in jams and jellies and wines. It likes um, rich, moist, well-drained soil. It's going to bear the best crop of fruit when it gets full sun. Make sure wherever you plant them, it's not like right over your driveway or sidewalk, because the purple berries are going to stain the concrete when they get smashed on it. But this is another one I think is a neat plant. It's with multi-seasonal interest. It's got this interesting scaly bark. I think the leaves are really interesting, the way that they're so variable. Some have an entire margin and then others are lobed, but the number of lobes can vary quite a bit from leaf to leaf. Here's a few varieties, cultivars that are recommended for our region, and this Illinois everbearing is a cross between the native red mulberry and white mulberry. Oh yeah, I forgot to say that's the two that will grow or you'll find in our region is the native red mulberry and the imported white mulberry, which was brought here back in colonial times when they were trying to start up the silk industry because it's the host plant for the silkworms. Um, but they couldn't compete with the European industry, and so that kind of fell by the wayside, but we still have the white mulberry trees around today. Next, this one is exotic. The jujube or jujuba is the name of this one, and which we're talking about these little fruits, not the candy like you get when you go to the movies. But if we were in China right now, we wouldn't even include this in our presentation because they've been eating jujube fruits for thousands of years. It's the plant spread down the Silk Road through Asia all the way to Europe, and then it finally arrived here in the United States back in the mid 1800s. But it didn't really become popular until the early 1900s when this guy Frank Meyer, who's a famed plant explorer, brought them back from one of his expeditions to China. And back there in the early 20th century, there was a number of these guys like Frank Meyer. A lot of them worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but they traveled all over the world seeking out different varieties of plants that they could bring back here to incorporate into our what was a rather bland diet at the time, or for different commercial purposes. But Frank Meyer, he brought back over 200 or 2,500 different plants that we recognize today, amongst them soybeans, bamboo, Chinese cabbage, elms, bean sprouts, water chestnuts, and even zoysia grass. And there's a lemon tree, the Meyer lemon, which is a dwarf lemon with very sweet fruit that was named after him. And plant geneticists thought so highly of this guy that they named an award that they give out annually in his honor. They give it out for outstanding contributions to conservation of plant diversity for humanity's future. And if you look on the medallion there, that plant on the right is the jujube. Oops, skipped one. Okay, there we go. And it prefers average, medium, moist, well-drained soil, but it likes full sun. It likes it hot because that's where it came from, rather hot, dry areas of China. But of course, you want to make sure it gets plenty of moisture as well. It'll tolerate alkaline soil, so it's well suited for around here. The two most common cultivars you're going to find is this Li and Lang, which of course were imported by our friend Frank Meyer. And there's actually a cultivar named Topeka that was developed at K-State that you might be able to find around here. Do it again. There we go. Next one is the Englishman's grape, the elderberry. And this is a plant that was already well known to the English colonists because it grows all over England as well. But it grows really all over the world. And it's one of the most commonly used medicinal plants in the world, dating back clear to ancient Egypt. Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician who's recognized as the father of modern medicine, called the elderberry nature's medicine cabinet. And it's called the Englishman's grape because it has a lot of the same properties that grapes have that make it really good for making wine. And since it grows wild all over the place in England, it was very popular, particularly amongst the lower classes, because you could go out and there was a ready supply of free elderberries you could gather to make up some really tasty wine that just happened to be ripe right around or ready to drink right around Christmas or New Year's. And in Victorian times, you would see a lot of street vendors that would have carts like in this picture with hot elderberry wine that you could purchase you a cup of hot elderberry wine to stave off the cold and fortify you against colds. And it's still a folk medicine over the world today. And it's gained a lot of popularity in the US as a supplement to help fight colds and flu. And that's because it's very high in vitamin C and a lot of antioxidants. And it's a native shrub that you'll find here in eastern Kansas that can get about 10 foot tall. I think it's a very pretty plant. It has these compound leaves. It gets these big clusters of little white flowers and then the dark berries. It does well in medium to wet, well-drained soil, so it doesn't mind getting its feet a little wet, and it'll tolerate some shade. It's good for making pies, jams, jellies, flavored drinks, and of course wine. And there's a few varieties that our K-State recommends for our neck of the woods here. Next one is the Serviceberry, which I called the Herald of Spring because the early colonists, they had many names for this plant besides Serviceberry: Juneberry, Shadblow, Shadbush, amongst many others. But they all have to do with the fact that it's like the first bush that flowers in the spring. And so, you know, back in colonial times when we were a more agrarian society and we didn't have the good roads we have today, people would have to wait until the spring thaw, which happened in June out there, and for the circuit riders or itinerant preachers to come around to perform various religious services, thus the name Serviceberry. So they'd come around and do weddings and baptisms and even funeral services in the spring. But it also coincided with the shad run, which the shad was a fish that was a staple of the colonist diet. And about the same time this bush bloomed out there is when the shad would come up out of the ocean into the inland waterways, and colonists knew it was time to go catch them some shad. And it's another bush that another plant with some good multi-seasonal interests. It grows as a small tree or shrub and gets these pretty white flowers in the spring. And it's good for cooking. You can eat them raw or you can use them for cooking and baking and those purposes. It tolerates a range of soils. And here's a look at what the plant looks like. We have our own native downy serviceberry, which probably isn't going to have quite as good fruit as these recommended varieties do, but they all are plants that, besides having the pretty flowers in the spring, and they get this nice colored fall foliage too. And then this spring flurry, that's one I can tell you is definitely a cultivar, because this fellow J.F. Schmidt, who's a well-known nurseryman and plant breeder, developed this spring flurry, which is more of a tree form of the plant. And I guarantee you, he didn't spend a lot of time and money developing spring flurry, so you could just go pick some seeds from it and plant you another one. He wants you to buy another plant from him. Next, gooseberries. This is another one that was popular with the British colonists before they arrived in the here in the United States. But back in the from the mid 18th century up until just after World War II, there were these gooseberry clubs and societies all over the countries that would compete to see who could develop the best gooseberries, to see about if they the most tasty blue gooseberries, and particularly the biggest gooseberries. And there's still some of these clubs around today. This gentleman here, Graham Watson, who belongs to this Egton Bridge Old Gooseberry Society, back in 2019, grew what they called the Holy Grail of gooseberries. And he won the Guinness Book of World Records record for the heaviest gooseberry ever grown. And I believe he still holds the record today. And there's a picture of Graham showing off his big berries. But most gooseberries that you'll find in nurseries around here are going to be a cross between that European variety, which has the bigger, more flavorful fruit, and our North American native plant that is provides hardiness and disease resistance to the plant. It's kind of a smallish spreading shrub, 3 foot by 6 foot. And it's a plant that likes a lot of morning sun, but is going to like a little shade in the afternoon. And the fruits are sweet and slightly tart, but I think they're good eaten raw. But they're also used a lot for muffins and pies and jellies and even fruit salads. And then Pixwell and Welcome are a couple that will do well here in our region. Next is Currants, and they're in this same genus as gooseberry, so they're closely related. The interesting thing about currants is that in 1911, the growing of currants was actually banned in the United States. They grew a lot of currants out on the East Coast, and back then we also had a more robust timber industry on the East Coast at that time, and they had a big issue with these currants because it's an intermediate host for white pine blister rust. And if you see on this example of it on a pine tree, you can see it does a lot of damage to the tree. And if you don't cut out that diseased tissue and destroy it, it can spread to the whole tree and kill it. Whereas on the currant, it just does more cosmetic damage to the plant, but it's deadly to pine trees. And so the timber industry got the growing of currants banned until 1966, when by that time they developed more disease-resistant currants. And so the ban was lifted in most of the United States. But the name comes from the ancient city of Corinth, where they were famous for growing these little grapes that they would dry into raisins called Zante currants. And I guess the Europeans thought that these berries resembled those Corinthian currants, thus the name. But it was grown in Europe since the Renaissance, and then, like I said, they brought it over to the new world with them. But it's a plant that the native variety was a staple in the diet of our indigenous people long before then. And a lot of times they would dry these and mash them up and mix them in with meat to make pemmican. And this is another one that's got some good multi-season interest because it gets the nice red fall foliage. Um, it's another one that's very nutritious, and like gooseberries, it likes full sun in the morning but a little shade in the afternoon. Um, if you want to grow the native variety, crandall is a good choice. And and then here, Red Lake and Wilder are a couple of the imported variety that will do well around here. Next is the old forgotten cherry, Nanking cherry, which was introduced to the U.S. in the late 1800s. And back then, plant breeders thought this plant had a lot of commercial potential. Uh, when they gathered them over in China, there was a lot of different varieties of them. So there was a lot of genetic diversity, and plant breeders like this fellow George Darrow um, saw a lot of potential in this plant. So during the 1930s, there was a lot of work going on with the breeding of these plants to try and make it a commercial cherry here in the US. But then by 1940, it kind of fell out of favor because there was other cherries like Bing cherries that came along that were easier to harvest and ship and had a longer shelf life. But there's kind of a resurgence of looking at this as viable commercial fruit. They're doing research at University of Wisconsin right now to develop more marketable varieties of Nanking cherry. And they're also doing research on a number of other unusual fruits there as well. But nowadays, it's primarily grown as an ornamental, but they're tart cherries like you would use for making pies and preserves and juices and that kind of thing. And Mr. Darrow, or Dr. Darrow, I should say, he's another one of these plant explorers that was famous for the plants that he brought back to the US. At the time, he was recognized as the world's foremost authority on strawberries. And the Nanking cherry is a spreading shrub or small tree. It can get pretty good size, but you can see it's a real pretty plant, gets these pretty blooms, and then the pretty little red berries on there. But it's a plant that's very heat and cold tolerant, and once it's established, it's a pretty drought tolerant plant. So I mean, that's one reason why it became a popular ornamental, is because it's a pretty easy plant to grow. But you will need more than one plant because it needs cross-pollination. So you need more than one cherry bush if you're going to want to get some cherries. Next plant is one that you're going to find all over Kansas, wild plum. And here in Kansas, we have two varieties. There's the American or wild plum that you can find all over the state. But more commonly out west, you're going to find the sandhill plum, or it's also called the Chickasha plum. Like if you go to Oklahoma, they call it Chickasha plum down there. But the native plains people valued it in their diet, and then early explorers and travelers, talked about how they enjoyed the wild plum. When the pioneers came out and settled in the Great American Desert, they came from back east where they were used to orchards and berry thickets, and then they got out there and it was like not a whole lot of that. But they were happy to find these wild plums and found them a pretty good little fruit to add to their diet. This picture here from the Kansas Historical Society was taken out in Osborne, Kansas, this little old soddy here. And standing there in front of the doorway is Martin Muller, and there on the far right is his son Jacob, and both of those gentlemen served terms as the Kansas Secretary of Agriculture. Probably did a little promoting of the wild plum while they were doing that. But it can grow as a multi-stemmed shrub or small tree. They both will sucker freely. So it's one that if you don't want it to spread, you got to, uh, keep those suckers trimmed back. But a lot of times it's grown like as a hedge or a windbreak. And so, it's well suited to those purposes because it spreads easily. Um, and The plums ripen in early summer. Its flowers in early spring, and then it gets the plums in early summer, which you can eat just off the bush. But the big thing around here is people like to make jelly out of it. And I've met a lot of people that this was like a family tradition of theirs that they go out every summer and gather up these wild plums and make a batch of jelly out of them. And I will gotta say, it makes pretty good jelly. Uh, and last but not least, the new Superberry, Aronia berry. And it's called the new Superberry because it is even higher in antioxidants than a lot of other fruits that have been dubbed the superberry, like elderberries and currants and cranberries and blueberries. Um, the common name of this plant is the black chokeberry, which is pretty descriptive of the flavor of the raw berry. They're kind of sour and astringent, kind of like a cranberry, and thus the current name of Aronia berry to kind of make it a little more palatable sounding, because I don't think you'd be too anxious to drink a big glass of chokeberry juice. But the fruit, when it's ripe, fully ripe, is very high in sugar and has a nice sweet taste to it. Um, it's a originally was grown as an ornamental, um, and it's a shrub that can get up to about 6 feet tall, but it gets these pretty flowers in the spring, and then these blackish purple berries come on a bit later, and then it gets this glossy green leaves that turn a nice red color in the fall. And it's another one that's pretty easy to grow. There's 3 varieties there that'll do well around here. And that's all the plants I have to tell you about. I got a few resources for you here. This first one is a public K-State Extension publication that has a lot of recommended varieties of small, like shrub and tree fruit cultivars that do well here in Kansas. And then this one from Dyke Arboretum is about native berries that grow well in Kansas. And then the next 3, the unusual fruits for Kansas gardeners, parts 1 and 2, and then Pawpaw trees and native fruit were our publications that were written by our own horticulture agent, Ariel, and I think they're really good publications that have a lot of good information in them. And then I was telling you about University of Wisconsin and the research they're doing on Nanking Cherry and a lot of other unusual fruits at this Carindale farm, and which is pretty, if you're interested in other and unusual fruits, you might want to check out their website. And then for those of you that might be interested in developing a food forest garden, Project Food Forest website is a good resource for you. So I'm just going to wrap up by putting in a little plug for the Master Gardener program. If you love gardening, I think you would enjoy being a master gardener. We have a myriad variety of different kind of volunteer opportunities for you at our demonstration gardens, and growing stuff in our greenhouse and helping with educational programs like this. Um, if you're a gardening nerd like me, being a master gardener is one place where you can go and go on and on about gardening, and nobody's going to be like, God, when is Kevin going to shut up about this gardening stuff? And if there's anything you want to know about gardening, maybe there's an area of gardening you don't know much about that you'd like to know more, I guarantee you, you're going to find somebody in our group that can tell you everything you want to know. So we take applications now year round, and then they do the interviews are in August, and then the classes run from September into the early part of November. And if you need to contact us, here's our contact information. If you have any gardening questions right now, our response line is up and running. So give us a call, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation today. So Ariel, any questions?
That was great, Kevin. I think that we have been able to sort of answer questions as we go along. Some really good ones. Is the Aronia berry related to the choke cherry? Yes, they're both in the rose family. I didn't know that off the top of my head, but I was able to quickly find that out.
Yeah.
And just some different questions. We're all sort of drooling over the fact that Ross makes his own jam, and apparently, he makes his own wild plum jelly and then puts it over warm bread. So we were just drooling over that towards the end of the presentation.
Well, he's not alone. It surprised me how many, I first came across that plant when I was still working in our office at 5th and Jackson. There's a rain garden out there, and there was a thicket of these wild plums growing out there. And, late summer, I would always see all these people that would come from the office buildings around there with buckets and be picking all these plums off of there. And I'm like, what is going on with these people? So I finally went out and was like, what's the deal with these plums? They're like, oh, they make the best jelly, and I'm like, okay. So I finally tried some, and it is really good, Yeah.
Sounds great. Ross said he had a pawpaw question, so I will wait for him to either type it in the chat box or turn on his mic, whatever his preference is.
Okay.
There he is. Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, my question is, we live on 80 acres out in Dickinson County, just about a mile from Rock Springs Ranch, and we entered the forestry's forest improvement program last fall. And Thad Rhodes, the district forester, came out from K-State, and he discovered that we have about 5 acres of pawpaws growing down by the creek.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
I assume they're native. We tried some last fall and they're pretty good, but I was just curious if there's anything we could do for like improvement, or, because they're just every place you look, once you know what they look like, they're just all over. Some small, some big. We have some about 20 foot tall.
That's super cool.
So I didn't know if there was anything that would help. Like I said, I just assume they're native. I don't have no idea what variety they might be, but didn't know if there was anything that we could do to help improve them or cultivate them better. Or
if you want, Ross, I will send a link out when I send the post survey of where this recording is going to be, which is on our website, and we have actually a fruits tab on our website. And that's where the fact sheet that Kevin mentioned that I wrote up on pawpaws is, and you can check that out. A lot of it, though, is variety selection and establishment. So if you already have this great plethora, Kevin, feel free to add if you want, but to me, it sounds like you've got a great thing going.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it's a native stand, and, they're just going to do their thing. If they have a good place to grow, they don't really take, that's what's great about, all these unusual fruits is they don't really take a lot of care. But you know, you might want to check out. I can't remember that guy's name that has the website. You know who I'm talking about, Ariel. He wrote this
Yes.
book. I think it's called "For Love of Pawpaws" or something like that. But
Let me see if
that
I can
guy, I
find
mean,
it.
he wrote a book about pawpaws, and he has this website that is like everything you would ever want to know about a pawpaw and more.
Okay.
You can probably find there.
His name is Michael Judd, Judd, and
Oh yeah, that's right.
his book is called For the Love of Pawpaws.
Yeah,
Okay.
and this guy, he is. I mean, he is like the pawpaw guy. He's nuts about pawpaws.
Great. Well, thank you. It's I
Definitely.
know we discovered last fall after we found them that it's if you get them too early, they're not very good. But if you get them when they're just ripe, they are very good. But
Really,
Uh
really
huh.
good.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing about pawpaws is you got to kind of keep an eye on them because once they ripen up, you need to get out there and start gathering them because there's a lot of wildlife that just eat them up.
are.
Yeah. And Leslie made a good point in the chat box that, you know, it's so great that it's a natural native stand of pawpaws. But if you do get anything invasive in there, like bush honeysuckle, which isn't native, it shouldn't be here, that could be a major competitor. So just weed suppression, especially those non-native weeds, would be really
Oh
important.
yeah,
I'm glad you
bush
pointed that out.
honeysuckle. It'll overrun all your other understory plants, but you know, hopefully out there in rural Dickinson County, it's not a problem like it is in my yard.
Right, right. I actually had a question for you, Kevin.
Yeah.
We get so many questions in on the response line about strawberries and apples and peaches and all of these fruits that are just so labor intensive. I mean, when you look at the spray schedule for an apple,
Oh yeah.
it has you spraying nearly year round,
Yeah.
just for some trees. And don't even get me started on people trying to grow blueberries in our soils. Just it's really challenging.
Right.
So many, all the plants you mentioned have some feature where they're either native or drought tolerant or just hardier than what we think of as traditional fruits that we try to grow. So why do you think more people aren't trying to grow some of these natives and some of these less typical fruits?
Well, I think one reason is that people just don't know about them. I mean, you know, there's probably people out there growing these Nanking cherries that don't realize it's like, you know, you can eat those cherries off of that little ornamental bush. Um, but you know, a lot of them, you know, like I was saying, they're not plants that have a good shelf life. You know, uh, like pawpaws is a good example. I mean, you
Yeah.
got to get out there and get them when they're ripe, and you know, you can store them for a period of time if you can refrigerate them. Persimmons the same way, and you know, but persimmons, that's another good example. I mean, it's a fruit that maybe has a little longer shelf life than like a pawpaw, but when they're ripe, they're real mushy, you know, and so it's not something that is really lends itself to be sitting on a shelf in a supermarket somewhere.
Right.
Um, but you know, so they're not real commercial plants, but they're great for growing in your home landscape. And you know, um, I mean, ripe persimmons, I think, are just a delicious fruit. You know, and most people never, you know, they heard, you know, sour as a green persimmon. They're like, oh,
Right.
I'm gonna steer away from that. But they don't realize how really sweet and delicious the ripe ones are.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just tried persimmons for the first time, I think a year ago. A friend gave me some that they had grown and I thought they looked disgusting. But I made a bread that was very similar to banana bread and it was really good. Really,
Uh-huh.
really good. And they freeze beautifully, which I love.
Right.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
does anybody else have any questions for Kevin about unusual fruits or any questions about anything else we talked about today? Oh, Leslie mentioned in the chat box to check out the Kansas Native Plant Society because there are a ton of awesome native fruits on there, which is a great
Yeah.
resource. Thank you for sharing that, Leslie, which is awesome. If any of you think of questions later, don't hesitate to reach out. Oh, Callista asked, do you know if choke cherries grow wild here?
Yeah, they do.
They do? That's great. I wasn't sure about that one. I don't know that I've seen those wild. I remember growing up, mulberries were just everywhere, and I've seen Nanking cherries for sure, but
Yeah,
or the
yeah,
wild.
choke cherries grow here, but that's different than chokeberry.
Okay,
Yeah, they're two different plants. Uh-huh.
good clarification. Awesome.
Yeah, mulberries. No, we used to eat them like crazy when I
So
was a
did we.
kid. Turns your lips all purple. And
Yeah, your clothes all purple.
yeah.
Leslie asked, how can you tell our native mulberry?
Well, that isn't actually easy because I mean, like that Rubus alba, the white mulberry. You would think the mulberries are white, but not always. It can be a white mulberry and still have those purplish berries, um, and they all look very similar. I imagine that if you would go to, a tree key or something like that, that you might be, there's probably some differences in the appearance of the plant, but you can't tell just by looking at the berries if it's the native. And then there's also a black mulberry. Those aren't ones that really grow here, but that's the one that, I was saying the Romans introduced it to Britain. That's the one that they brought over as a medicinal plant.
Awesome. She's saying she's got one coming up in her yard. Probably you can thank the birds for that.
Oh
'Cause I
yeah,
know
right.
they're prolific. And then she's saying her ID app says it's Korean. I would ID apps can be really helpful to kind of narrow it down, but I would specifically, Leslie, look up like the leaf shape or the bark coloration on the Korean versus the native and see if there's some differences. And then we can always help with that if looking at slight differences in different tree bark isn't your jam like it is for some of us.
Right.
Any other questions today? Okay, I will be following up with the really short survey. If you've been on our other webinars, it's the same survey, very, very quick. And the survey really does help us show our stakeholders that what we're doing is valuable and enables us to continue to offer these services. So you'll get that in your inboxes later today. Please just take a minute and fill it out. Otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Kevin, who is our excellent teacher this afternoon. And we hope you all can join us for the rest of our webinars. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.